mentor for me, Xavier Leverve, who passed away and was the guy in the European Society who was really pushing and clarifying a lot some difficult issues which are biochemistry pathways, and by which way we can link this to the metabolic issues, and then from the metabolic issues, the circulation, and then to the organ failure. And I would like today to use this kind of concept and saying thank you to Xavier. So first of all, I would like to trouble you a bit, because I'm sure you remember very well your biochemistry and your physiology. And Jan, I agree with you, physiology is the only one thing that we should know, and pathophysiology then has to be understood by the doctors before making a decision to do something. And to do this, you need some basic concepts. And I know that, at least in France, the young doctors have no clue about physiology. They love tools, machines. I mean, E something, which is electronic, but electronic does not tell you what does it mean. And I would like to review some important things. First of all, you look at a patient, and the doctor says the patient is not well, globally speaking. And then, because of that, you go to the ICU and you put a needle to know the blood pressure. Oh, you reduce the patient to the blood pressure. And then you sample blood from the blood pressure and you look at the lactate. Oh, it's high. And then you reduce from the blood pressure to the lactate. And then you look at the echo and you go to the echo and you say, oh, the heart is not beating well, so you reduce the patient to heart failure. The patient is not well because globally, from the head to the feet, is not well. You don't know what happens in the gut, but I can suspect that the gut is not well perfused and not well functioning. The lung is not so well. The brain might be. And we get a SOFA score. The SOFA score means kidney, metabolic, liver, blah, blah, coagulation. So globally, you characterize the severity of the patients. Why do you want to see the global patients as a clinician with a global score and then going to a very small thing? Everything is linked. The metabolism, the immune staff, the circulation, all the things are linked together. So finally, if you keep in mind this, having one parameter to be checked, it's a strategy for you to make a decision to monitor this, and depending on the questions you suspect for the patient, the disease you suspect he has, you get another one. With the two, you get sometimes a good idea, but the third one you would like to know. And then you make a strategy for the numbers you would like to know to characterize globally the patients. And that's the way we are moving now, and we don't say this one is good, this one is bad. Everybody is fine, except that you are adapted to the question or you are not adapted to the question. The cardiologist is very good if you get a myocardial dysfunction. For the brain, the cardiologist is not so great. The neurologist is absolutely gorgeous for the subarachnoid hemorrhage, but the cardiologist taking care of the ICU patients is not so good for the brain injury. Or you go to the gut, and the surgeon doing the surgery and the ICU is very good for this kind of patient, but for the lung, the PF ratio, and the kidney, forget it. So finally, before having a tool, get a doctor who knows what he does and understanding what the patient has. Here it's a paper which is in Nature. Nature is a good journal, as you know. It's not in New England, as good as the New England, but it's not bad. It's something which is telling you the metabolic and immune systems are among the most fundamental requirements for survival. Then, for the survival means if you die, you can get abnormal metabolism and abnormal immune system, which is perhaps be assessed by some simple parameters. Look at this. This is something that everybody knows, the glucose. You remember the story of the glucose? We need to control tightly the glycemia. For me, it was always a nonsense. How many patients, how many human beings, how many animals, how many cats, how many dogs can escape to your unhappiness without having high level of glucose? If you measure the glucose in the cat and you say, is high. You give insulin to the cat will die. The stress response means insulin low and glucose high. The question might be, is the cell able to use the glucose which is high? That's another question. But the level of glucose you measure has to be high, otherwise you die. You see the marathonians, did you measure the glucose in the marathonians? We did it. It's always around 12 to 15. And when it's going to be around 7, the guy will stop the marathon. He will not complete the course. So finally, controlling tightly the glucose does not make sense. Giving exogenous glucose to the patients might be dangerous, and then you need insulin to control the glucose you give. That makes sense. And that's exactly what the GREAT finally showed in the New England paper. You remember this, the glucose has to go inside the cells. You remember that, transporter. For the immune staff, no need of insulin. The glucose goes to the immune cells freely according to the gradient between the extra and the intra. Then you go to the glycolysis, you know this very well, glucose 6-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate, etc. And then this is going to the pyruvate and going to the mitochondria, having oxidative phosphorylation, which is called the breathing of the cell. That's normal. For you at this moment, if I'm asking to you, you measure the oxygen consumption, the whole body oxygen consumption of a patient is around 120. What is the proportion of this oxygen consumption which is related to the oxidative phosphorylation? And you said, Didier, come on, you're stupid, my guy. It's 98%. Everybody knows that. Yes, you are right. Then you get an acute inflammation. In the ICU, you get essentially acutely inflamed patients. Otherwise, I don't know what you do. So the acute disease, acute inflammation is changing this relation. You get the molecular oxygen consumption becomes to be important from 2% to 20, 30, sometimes 40%. And it's used for cofactors of enzymes. It's used for reactive oxygen species synthesis, and then you reduce the ability of the oxidative phosphorylation to work normally. And that's a key issue. We shift when you get this important inflammation. You remember this. Glucose is coming from outside the mitochondria to create pyruvate, equilibrated with lactate. Then the pyruvate is going into the mitochondria, and under the pyruvate dehydrogenase, the PDH, you transform this in a CAR4, which is the acetyl coenzyme A. And then this CAR4 is coming from the free fatty acids or from the glucose, and that's a key point where you should keep in mind we can regulate very tightly. Then you get the so-called Krebs cycles or citric acid cycles, whatever, or tricarboxylic cycle, and then it's producing NADH, which is a electron transport for the mitochondria, and then by this way, the different respiratory chain complexes can work well, and then you produce ATP. Remember, the ATP synthesis is a double-sense enzyme. It could be ATP, ADP, ATP, or ATP, ADP, depending on the needs. Then, you take a cell which is white cells, monocytes, dendritic cells, polymorphonuclear cells, whatever. Each cell has two oxygen ways to be used. First is to keep the house alive. You clean, you warm, you are living in your house, you keep the house. The housekeeping functions, which means the pump, the sodium, the potassium, all the stuff like this are absolutely crucial to keep the cell alive. Then you do your specific function. So you are doing the job for the cell, and then the cell is contracting for the myocardial cells, is releasing cytokines or mediators for the immune cells, other functions depending on the type of the tissue you're looking for. And all of this needs ATP. When you have a sepsis issue or an acute inflammation, what happens? You see that the oxygen you use at the mitochondrial level is not to produce ATP, it's to keep the gradient, the electrical gradient for the electrons, and then you are using a lot of energy, but you are not producing ATP. This is so-called uncoupling mitochondria. And this is a reversible phenomenon, but during the acute phase, the mitochondria doesn't work well. because of this uncoupling mechanism. Then you have the erythrocyte. So everybody talks to everybody. It's nice to see that. It's producing the glucose from the erythrocytes. Then the glucose goes to create pyruvate, which is producing ATP a little bit. Then the pyruvate is in equilibrium with lactate you measure in the plasma, and the lactate goes to the liver, and then you use the lactate to create pyruvate, and you go back to the neoglycogenesis. Then from the lactate, which is a CAR4, you can go to the synthesis, or you can go to the lysis. And this is to be kept in mind. It's an equilibrium between the in and the out. What are the substrates for the immune cells? We speak about all the time the cells and the patient. We say, oh, the patient is immunosuppressed. I heard all the time the young doctors telling me is immunosuppressed. What do you mean by immunosuppressed? Is immunosuppressed? Yeah, but exactly what it means. Is immunosuppressed a boss? There's a boss for the moment, but you know. And I said, you have any parameter you know? You say hypotension because you look at the blood pressure. You say renal failure because you get a creatinine. You say the function of the lung is not good because of PF ratio. Why do you say immunosuppression? Based on what? Based on my knowledge. Trust me. Oh, I don't. And finally, if you look at the different cells which are flowing in the vessels, including the microvessels, to get an interaction between the white cells and the endothelial cells, that means that the white cells has to express some molecules on the surface, and the endothelial cells has to express the receptors of the molecules. And together, you can get a rolling. But sometimes you are so sick, they are not rolling at all. You get a huge number of white cells in your blood leukocyte count. You see 20, 30, 40,000 white cells. What does it mean? Who is looking about the number of white cells? You said this is leukostasis. That's it. Imagine you have a patient with 220,000 white cells. It exists, except leukemia. It may exist. That means the bone marrow is producing, and the cells are not going to the tissue for killing the bacteria. And sometimes you get a very small number of leukocytes, 1,000. Does it mean that the bone marrow doesn't work well, not producing too much, or you get a lot of cells going to Syria or Libya or whatever? Who knows? And that's a key issue we should solve before. Here, for example, for the neutrophil, the macrophages, the dendritic cells, they use essentially the glucose as the energetic substrate. This paper is a fantastic paper you should have in your computer. Immunity is, the impact factor is 38, which is not in New England, I agree with, but still 38 is a good level. Please check every month the immunity paper. Then, if you look at the effector T cells, they use, again, the glucose as a substrate to do the job. And you can see here the glucose with the pentose phosphate pathway. I don't know if you remember that. The shunt, the pentose phosphate shunt. Usually you forget. I forgot. The students have no clue. This is the only one source of NADPH. NADPH, and so what? NADPH is the only substrate for the NADPH oxidase to synthesize reactive oxygen species. And the ratio between the oxygen species synthesized by the mitochondria is 3%, 97 by the NADPH oxidase. It's a key issue. The more you give glucose, the more you create reactive oxygen species. Inflammation, metabolism are linked together? Yes, sir. Then if you go to the memory T cells or the Treg cells, which are immunosuppressive cells, and macrophages type 2, you see they use lipids, free fatty acids. And that may explain why the statins, which is good for everything or bad for everything, I don't know, depending on the New England Journal of Medicine reports, but the statin still is an interesting molecule to be tested, and the people are looking to that and they see some modification of immune stuff. If you are treated chronically before, in acute doesn't work, because of this, at least. A slide from Jan. which is a very important one for me as another concept we should keep in mind. Usually, the doctors are reacting on the blood pressure. Blood pressure is fine, the doctor is sleeping. Blood pressure goes down, the doctor is awake. And then he says, oh, hypertension, I should do something. I give fluid, I don't know what kind of fluid, balanced, not balanced, starch or not, blah, blah, blah. And then the pressure is still lowish. I give presses. Because I expect that constricting the vessels will improve the pressure. But if I'm constricting the vessels, I'm not flowing well. The flow to the tissue could be not so good. And you mentioned, and I agree with what you said, we need flow to the tissues at least to be sure that they are perfused. What's the reason for giving this so huge amount of norepinephrine? The doctors told me I give 0.4 milligram per hour of norepinephrine, which is a small dose. I said, come on, I will give you 0.4 milligrams of norepinephrine to you, my friend. If you stay alive more than 1 minute, you are a hero. Because your value of norepinephrine is a picogram, 10 over minus 9. And then you give milligram, 10,000 more. It's a small dose. Are you crazy? The guy is not responding, fortunately, to the norepinephrine you give because the cells are sick. But the dose you give is a huge amount of dose. They don't understand that. And for this, you see the normal tone, vascular tone is here. If you do the constriction, you stop. You de-recruit some vessels if they are responding to norepinephrine. You stop the flow. The pressure is fine with no flow. Do you prefer to be dead with a good pressure or alive with a lower pressure? Personally, I prefer to be alive with a lower pressure than a high pressure and be dead. Do you agree with? I'm sure you do. Okay, what is the goal? The goal might be the perfusion. We heard about the perfusion that is very important to know what's going on. And we discussed that. I don't have the time to go through, and Jan did that very well. Personally, as Maurizio said, for the moment, if I'm going to the shopping center to buy a machine for useful monitoring for the patients with the student I have, they are very good, very smart with the iPhone 6, but we don't have the perfusion i6 machine to know where we are. It's coming. I heard that it's coming, and I'm very happy for that. But for the moment, we don't have. And maybe having several approaches, several machines may help a lot, and the multimodal monitoring would be the good one. Okay. Just to show you, he said very important thing, as usual. Sometimes you get a pressure which is lowish. You go to the patients, his blood will perfuse. You give fluids, and you see the cardiac output goes up. And sometimes it does not go up. And you say, this one is responder, the other one is not responder. Understood and not understood. And then you look at the microcirculation, not at the big circulation, but the small one, and see what's going on. And we tested this in one of the patients with septic shock. And we were classifying the patients for the big circulation, those who were increasing the flow with the fluid, and those who were not increasing the flow, at least for 15%. And then we choose another marker for the small circulation. We use the NIRS with the slope for the reperfusion, which was always altered, is constant. Everybody showed that. When you get an abnormal inflammation or too strong inflammation, the slope for reperfusion, when you stop the flow, the reperfusion slope is lowish. Then if you have two types of patients, one who is improving when you give something, some fluids, and some who are not improving, responder and not responder. And then you see here, you have the micro non-responders, the micro responders, the micro responders, and the micro non-responders. I suspected that the patients who were not responding to the big will not respond to the small, and vice versa. So we observe that this is the patients, and you see the micro responders are divided by 2. They can be small vessels responders or small vessels non-responders. If you look at the micro-responders improving the cardiac output for more than 15%, I suspected that the microvessels, the microcirculation will be improved. No, they are divided into 2 conditions. Some improved and some didn't. So finally, with the big circulations response, you cannot predict what will happen for the small. And that's a very important issue for the doctors. You need both, in a way. Okay? So then we classify in these patients who is coherent, always improving or always deteriorating, and who is not coherent. So you get an improvement for one and non-improvement for the other. And you see 57% were coherent and 43 were not coherent. So that means that the big circulation and the small circulation are not moving together, at least for 50% of the patients. And that's a major information that we wanted to know. Regional blood flow. We have the cardiac output, and then we expect that the cardiac output resuscitation may help the perfusion for the tissues. I disagree totally. I have a question for you. You have healthy people, you get the cardiac output, you get the cerebral blood flow. Normally, if I understand, if I remember correctly, in healthy subjects, the cerebral blood flow is independent from the cardiac output, right? Do you agree with? Who disagrees? For the blood pressure is the same. It's auto-regulated. Fine. Then I have a sepsis, a trauma. 2 minutes. A trauma, a sepsis. What happens for the relationship between the systemic blood flow and the cerebral blood flow? Who knows that? Who saw any paper on that? 0. We apply the physiology to the pathophysiology. Might be true, but we should know if it's true or not. We just completed this study. The cerebral blood flow depends both on cardiac output and blood pressure when you get an acute inflammation versus the healthy control. And that makes sense. If you play with norepinephrine and your flow and your volume, you can change the brain size, which is not perhaps so good to change the brain size. Just to go down, I'm going rapidly because I shift SvO2. You know that very well. I don't want to show you that. Lactate. Everybody thinks that the lactate is a good parameter for everything. The lactate is high, not perfused. Lactate is normal, well perfused. I fully disagree with this. Lactate is just a marker of stress. It's a stress molecule. It could be ischemic lactate, but most of the time it's not ischemic. It's just a stress molecule. The more stress you are, the more the lactate you have. The marathonians have 5 or 6 millimoles of lactate. When he's running after 20 kilometers, 20 is around this middle marathon, and they have a high lactate. And the point is this one, which is a very old concept. You see the adrenaline you release, stimulating the AMPC, the cyclic AMP, which is stimulating the glycogen glycolysis. Then you get more glucose, you get more pyruvate, you get more lactate, and you get a higher lactate in the blood. If the patients you give adrenaline as a test is not able to increase the lactate level, the cells are dead. The prognosis is catastrophic, and Bruno Levy showed that very nicely in critical care medicine a couple of years ago. It's very crucial. The lactate is a stress molecule more than any other thing. Where the lactate comes from? Initially, everybody knows that it's all lactate, the liver, blood, the muscles. When you are sleeping on your bed with sedation, you are not doing a lot of things with your skeletal muscles, and the lactate are not coming from the muscles, they're coming from the lung. And many papers show that the lactate came from the lung when you are very sick with an acute inflammation and acute lung injury. CO2, last slide. Mr. Chairman, this is a Janisha slides. I completed this with the CO2. We know very well the arterial SvO2 is going to the tissues. the oxygen diffused to the tissues, then the SvO2 is 0.65, 65%, and go back to the heart. Sometimes you get some clots, and you are not delivering the oxygen to the tissue, then you keep the oxygen on the hemoglobin, and then you move with the SvO2, which is 0.94. You are not extracting. And then the merge of this blood to this one is putting something which is on the central venous oxygen saturation quite normal, or maybe good, or very good, and the doctor is very happy because the SvO2 is very good. Be suspicious. It's very good, but it's not used by the tissue. It could be very good if the tissue are very happy with, but if they are not, you go back home with too much oxygen. That's not good. And what happened for the CO2? Same thing. The CO2 is not removed because you are not flowing. You are a stagnant hypercapnia. Then the CO2 is here. You see the 55, and the merge of the two, the CO2 is not diffusing well at this area, and then the merge of the two is telling you something about the CO2 60. And then you get hypercapnia on the venous side, and you don't understand a good SvO2, a high PCO2, so what does it mean? It's a stagnant hypoperfusion to many tissues you get. And with this parameter, if you are able to know what happens for the CO2, and this is an old story with a TonoCap for the older guys, we did in the 80s and 90s, the TonoCap in the gastric area, showing that the gradient between the CO2 locally and the CO2 on the arterial side, the higher was the gradient, the lower was the perfusion for the gut. And we developed something which is a patent, Max. I agree with you. This is a great guy. He was the first one showing the sublingual CO2 was increasing rapidly in hemorrhage, largely more rapidly than in the gut, and it was as efficient as the lactate was. And then we applied this at the ear lobe with a small transducer. I have a patent on that. I have to disclose this. And this is telling you the CO2 at the earlobe. There is no muscle here, only beautiful rings and earlobe decoration for the ladies, but for the men, not too much. And then here you see the CO2 goes up. It means it's not perfused. It goes down, means you are well perfused, referring to the end-tidal CO2. So it's purely non-invasive microperfusion assessment. And we added a second patent on that to know the vascular test. We warm this transducer. Normally, when you warm a vessel, you dilate. If you dilate, you flow more. If you flow more, you reduce the CO2, which is not anymore stagnant, and the gradient goes down. If the gradient is not changed by the warming, you get a vascular problem. Thank you very much for